So for Mother's Day this year, I got to thinking about Matthew's genealogy, where Matthew does something that's a bit unusual in that he includes women in his genealogy, which was not a common thing back then. And it's because heritage was always pretty much traced primarily through the male. And so, the unique thing about Matthew's genealogy is he actually includes 5 different women in it, including Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Bathsheba, and then obviously Mary. And as I thought about that this year, it just kind of spurred some things in my mind about these women. And you know me, I don't usually title my teaching time. Everybody always comes up with fancy titles for their series and their messages and all that kind of stuff. And I'll actually say I've got an aversion to that. I don't know what it is. And maybe it's because I don't like the idea of crafting and all this kind of stuff. I'm just kind of like, I'm just going to go through the text here. But occasionally we'll title our messages and things like that. And so while I was thinking through this, I started thinking, there's an interesting thread about these 5 women that are in the genealogy. And the thing that sort of ties them all together is they all had a part in what I'm going to refer to as saving the world. If you think about it, because God's redemptive plan was to save mankind. And so that kind of just popped into my head, and then it's one of those things where I was almost embarrassed. I went, I can't do that. I can't do that. But I thought, boy, that'd make a great sermon title, wouldn't it? Women who helped save the world, and I started thinking, all those pastors that do all the superhero series and stuff like that, but I thought, I'm going to go ahead and be silly anyway. So if I had to title this one, it would be Women Who Helped Save the World. And the reason I'm going to do that is because it wasn't just these 5 women that we see in the genealogies. As I began to think about the moms in the Old Testament and even some in the New Testament, that all had a part and are all connected to God's redemptive plan. And they all played their role in that. And it also made me think, we're told in the New Testament that the Old Testament was designed to be a tutor to lead us to Christ or to point us to Christ. And I thought, it's interesting when we look at some of these moms in the Old Testament and again some in the New, how they fill that role and how ultimately in some form or some capacity they point the world, or they played a role in pointing the world to Christ through God's redemptive plan. And so as I thought about that, there were 13 different women I came up with. Now we're not going to go through all of them today, but we're going to go through some. And so today's going to be a little bit different. Normally, we do this exegetical approach to the Scriptures. We get into the details of that, and we sometimes quote you the Greek and the Hebrew and all that. Today we're just going to simply look at these individuals, and then I'm just going to reflect on them. And just going to reflect on their role in God's redemptive plan, and in some respects how these moms had a part in helping to save mankind or to save the world. And hopefully through that we'll have some encouragement. Makes me think about my own mom and her role in my own life and my faith as well. So we're gonna do that. So the first one, obviously, the first place to start, I thought, was Sarah, because we've been going through the Abrahamic story, and Sarah immediately came to mind. Now, we learned a number of things about Sarah in our study of Genesis over the past few months, including her struggles with her pregnancy and her discouragement with not being able to have a child, and even some disbelief when God promised that she would be able to have a child. Remember, she kind of laughed. And then when God says, why'd she laugh? He gave her the side eye, and she's like, I didn't laugh. And yes, you did. So we learned some things about Sarah that maybe don't jump right off the page as being this godly, woman who's going to point us to Christ, except that we also have the New Testament that is inspired, which means it was written by God. And if you think about what God said about Sarah, we see some things, especially when we look at Peter and then even the author of Hebrews. So turn to Hebrews chapter 11. Hebrews chapter 11. And this is kind of interesting. You know how sometimes you look at a passage of Scripture, it's like, I know that. Almost don't even have to turn there. Just sort of, I know what it says. And so as I thought about this, I'm glad I did, because of something that sort of dawned on me here. But look at Hebrews chapter 11, verse 11. This is the Hebrews Hall of Faith. It lists, we talked about this a couple of weeks ago, all these individuals like Abraham and some of the others who died in faith without fully receiving all of God's promises, and Sarah is one of them. And it says in chapter 11, verse 11 of Hebrews, by faith even Sarah herself received ability to conceive, even beyond the proper time of life, since she conceived him, or considered him faithful who had promised. And so the things we see that show up here is that Sarah herself, her belief that God could ultimately do what He did, was an act of faith. She believed that God could do it, and it says here that she considered Him faithful. And so, seeing what we see in the Old Testament with Sarah kind of laughing initially, she came to a point, obviously, the text tells us here, where she believed that God could do what He said He would do. And so, he starts off here immediately by saying that it was because of Sarah's faith. Now, what oftentimes I've missed about this passage is to look at the very next verse, because I've always assumed the next verse really had to do more with Abraham. But look at the way that it reads. Verse 12. So it says at the very end of verse 11, since she considered him faithful who had promised, therefore, which means there's a link now, therefore there was born even to one man, in him as good as dead, at that, as many descendants as the stars of the heaven in number and innumerable as the sand which is by the seashore. Does that jump off the page to anybody else? I looked at this and I kind of went, wait a minute. What he's just done here is he has placed the fulfillment of the promise that God made to Abraham onto the shoulders of Sarah and her faith. Because it says, therefore, because of her faith, there was born to this man who was pretty much dead a multitude of descendants. And so it elevates the role of Sarah now to this significantly important role, and because of her faith, the promises that God had made to Abraham weren't just based off of Abraham's faith. She wasn't an insignificant player in this. She was a significant player, and it required her to have the kind of faith she did in order that God would fulfill His promises that He made to Abraham. I'll be real frank. I've never seen that before. Now, if you would have asked me about it and brought it up, I would have gone, that's an interesting thought. So I don't know how I've missed this before, but it made me sit back and think, wow, it's because of Sarah's faith as well, not just Abraham's faith, that God fulfilled His promises to Abraham. So obviously, as we look at this, Sarah played a part in God's redemptive plan, because we ultimately know that God's redemptive plan was that through Abraham and through his descendants, and ultimately through Sarah, He would bring about not just the state of Israel, but His seed, which was Christ, which would ultimately bring salvation to who? Not just the Jews, but He said, I'll make you a blessing to all nations. So Sarah, because of her faith, played an absolutely huge role in saving the world and bringing about salvation to mankind. That's a pretty significant role, isn't it? For a mom. I love that about this. How about another one? Does the name Jochebed ring a bell? Jochebed was the mother of Moses. We see that in Numbers chapter 26. It gives us her name. And we learn about her role in God's redemptive plan in Exodus chapter 1 and 2. You can turn there. I'm just going to summarize this, but you remember the story. After spending almost 400 years in captivity, the Israelites were multiplying like rabbits. And because of that, the Egyptians, Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, can't really blame him, hundreds and hundreds of years later, began to get concerned because the Israelites would soon outnumber the Egyptians. And since the Egyptians were enslaving the Israelites, what do you expect might happen? They might just decide to put down their shovels and their pickaxes and their straw making and decide not to do it anymore. And so, to sort of head that off, the Pharaoh goes to the midwives of the Hebrews and says, kill all the male children. Well, because of the godliness of the midwives and their fear of the Lord, they said, no, we can't do that, and they just refused. So then the Pharaoh basically ordered his own people to simply kill the males, the male children. And so then you have this story of Jochebed who gives birth to her son, and she's got a decision to make. Because if she doesn't hide the child gets killed. So we find her story in Exodus chapter 2. Go ahead and turn there, Exodus chapter 2. I'm going to read through, about 10 verses or so. Exodus chapter 2, starting in verse 1. Now a man from the house of Levi went and married a daughter of Levi, that's Jochebed. The woman conceived and bore a son, and when she saw that he was beautiful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could hide him no longer, imagine, because he's a little toddler and moving around pretty well, she got him a wicker basket and covered it over with tar and pitch. She put the child into it and she set it among the reeds by the bank of the Nile. His sister stood at a distance to find out what would happen to him. The daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe in the Nile with her maidens walking alongside the Nile. And she saw the basket along the reeds and sent her maid, and she brought it to her. When she opened it, she saw the child, and behold, the boy was crying. And she had pity on him and said, "This is one of the Hebrews' children." Then his sister said to Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and call a nurse for you from the Hebrew women, that she may nurse the child for you?" Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Go ahead." So the girl went and called the child's mother. Then Pharaoh's daughter said to her, "Take this child away and nurse him for me, and I will give you your wages." So the woman took the child and nursed him. The child grew, and she brought him to Pharaoh's daughter, and she became her son. And she named him Moses, and said, "Because I drew him out of the water." Now, the interesting thing about this story here is, when you look at Jochebed here, she had a plan. We just sort of think, she just put the child in a little basket and sent him down the Nile, but it doesn't say that. It says she placed him in among the weeds. The fact that this happens to be in front of the palace of the Pharaoh's daughter suggests that it was a deliberate act. Not only that, but when she does this, she doesn't just send Moses down the Nile, but sends Moses' sister to go there to keep an eye on Moses. And based on what we read here, it seems for the purpose specifically of watching, so that when the Pharaoh's daughter came down and saw the basket and took it, that she might be able to pop out of the weeds and say, "Oh, you're going to need a nursemaid. I've got somebody in mind," which happens to be Moses' mother. And so this plan that she orchestrated, I believe, she did so that she might be able to maintain her relationship with Moses in those pivotal years in his life. She knew that she would have to give him up at some point, at the point at which he is weaned. But this was a way for her to be able to continue to maintain that relationship in the most formidable time of Moses' life. And so she comes up with this, I'll call it a scheme. And in some respects it's a dangerous scheme, because she's violating the laws of the Pharaoh. But it works out rather well, because just as planned here, the Pharaoh's daughter comes out, sees Moses. Moses' sister pops up, does exactly what she's supposed to do, and the next thing you know, Jochebed has Moses back in the home and is now weaning her child. It's interesting because when you think about the significance of this, with Egypt being a pagan nation with all their gods, and yet we understand, based on what we see at other times in Moses' life, he understood his heritage. He understood, he didn't necessarily know Yahweh by name, it doesn't appear, because he asks who it is that's going to send him when he sees the burning bush, but he had a religious heritage. He understood who his Hebrew people were. He understood that he was an Israelite. And so he had a fondness for them as well. You remember the story where he kills the Egyptian for beating an Israeli slave. Where do you suppose that came from? We've got 5 books of our Old Testament, the first 5 that are attributed to Moses. God used him tremendously. In fact, he was probably the most prolific and important Old Testament prophet we have. He not only rescued the Israelites, he took them through the wilderness, he delivered the law to them, he wrote the first 5 books of our Old Testament. I'm inclined to think that Jochebed had something to do with that. We know ultimately it's God's work. But she didn't just abandon her son. She didn't just send him along. She made sure that she was able to continue to have this relationship with him at the most formidable time of his life. And as a result, we have probably one of God's most important and prolific Old Testament servants. In fact, he became a type of Christ, saying that one like him would come, which ultimately was Christ. So, Jochebed, tremendous influence. The role she played there, obviously, is pretty clear, because without Moses and the prophets and Israel and the law, we wouldn't have something to point us and to direct us back to Christ. So she played a significant role in God's redemptive plan and in ultimately helping to save the world. How about another one? You all know this one. Rahab. Anybody remember who Rahab was? Rahab was the mother of Boaz. She happened to become the husband of Ruth. She actually is mentioned in Matthew's genealogy. But she's interesting on a couple of different levels. One of them is that she wasn't an Israelite. She was actually a Canaanite prostitute. She was from the city of Jericho. You remember the story? The Israelites were coming into the land, and Jericho happened to be probably the strongest, most important, and most fortified city in the Jordan Valley. And so as Israel is looking at that, Joshua sends 2 spies into the city. The king ultimately of Jericho learns about it. He sends men to capture these 2 spies, and they find this house of a prostitute named Rahab, likely along the city walls, because that's typically where people would live. And so they seek refuge there. The king's people come and knock on the door, and what does she do? I don't know what you're talking about. Oh, those guys. Yeah, they went out. Go find. They're down there. They're running away outside the city walls. I saw them do it. And she hides them up on her rooftop. Again, a very bold move to defy the king. What would happen if he found out? And you have to ask, why would she do that? What kind of skin did she have in the game? That's a pretty significant risk to take, especially when you would consider Israel to be your enemy. You know they're outside getting ready to ransack the city. So when you think about it, Rahab was willing to sacrifice or to forsake her home, her culture, her religion, and even her past. And there's a reason why she did that. I want you to turn to Joshua chapter 2. Joshua chapter 2, starting in verse 8. We'll read down through verse 21. But now before they lay down, she came up to them on the roof, and she said to them, I know that the Lord... And it's interesting, look at the name that she uses there. Your Bible probably has all capitals there. That's Yahweh. I know that Yahweh has given you the land, and that the terror of you has fallen on us, and that all the inhabitants of the land have melted away before you. For we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea before you when you came out of Egypt, and what you did to the 2 kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan, to Sihon and Og, who you utterly destroyed. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, and with no courage remained in any man any longer because of you. For the Lord your God, He is God of heaven above and on earth beneath. That's quite a declaration. She's just declared Yahweh God over her own gods, the gods of the Canaanites. Now therefore, please swear to me by the Lord, since I have dealt kindly with you, that you will deal kindly with my father's household and give me a pledge of truth. And spare my father and my mother and my brothers and my sisters and all who belong to them, and deliver our lives from death. So the men said to her, Our life for yours if you do not tell this business of ours, and it shall come about when the Lord gives us the land that we will deal kindly and faithfully with you. Now, we might be inclined here to simply say that she's just trying to cover her own skin. She sees the writing on the wall. We'll see something different in a minute. Verse 15, And then she let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall, so that she was living on the wall. She said to them, Go to the hill country, so that the pursuers will not happen upon you, and hide yourselves there for 3 days until the pursuers return. Then afterward you may be on your way. The men said to her, We shall be free from this oath to you which you have made to us swear, unless when we come into the land, you tie this cord of scarlet thread in the window through which you let us down, and gather to yourself into the house your father and your mother and your brothers and all your father's household. It shall come about that anyone who goes out of the doors of your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head, and we shall be free. But let everyone who is with you in the house, but anyone who is with you in the house, his blood will be on your head if a hand is His blood shall be on our head if a hand is laid on him. But if you tell this business of ours, then we shall be free from this oath which you have made us swear And she said, according to your words, so be it. So she sent them away, and they departed, and she tied a scarlet thread in the window. And so we see this plan of Rahab's now. Hebrews chapter 11, turn back there for me again. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31. Hebrews chapter 11. Look at what it says about Rahab, verse 31. By faith, Rahab the harlot did not perish along with those who were disobedient after she had welcomed the spies in peace. That means that it wasn't just about saving her own skin. There was an element of faith to what she did. And I believe that might be one reason why she uses the name Yahweh instead of just your God. Remember, there's a certain association with that name Yahweh that symbolizes or suggests a relationship of some kind. Now, I'm not saying that Rahab was saved at that moment beforehand, but Moses may have chosen to use that or write it the way that he did to suggest that there was something more there than just saving her skin. She recognized that God was heaven, or God of heaven and earth above all things. She knew what He had done for the Israelites. Even above her own gods, she was willing to forsake her own gods, her own place, her own country, her own city, her own people, for the sake of Yahweh. And Hebrews tells us here that it's because of faith. And so she keeps her promise, just like we would expect. Joshua chapter 6, verse 25, Rahab the harlot and her father's household and all that she had, Joshua spared. And it says this in Joshua chapter 6. That she lived in the midst of Israel to this day, meaning at the point which Moses had written the first 5 books here. Joshua, when Joshua had written Joshua. That even at that day, that she was a part of Israel. In fact, what's interesting is that she married a man named Salmon who was an Israelite. So she married a Jewish man. And she became the mother of Boaz, who is the godly man who married Ruth. And that's the picture we get of Boaz. Which again begs the question, I wonder what kind of influence Rahab had on Boaz. As you might expect, much like our own culture, moms often have the greatest influence on their children. Even more so in many respects in the ancient Near East, because they were the ones who raised the children. An agricultural economy and everything else. And so it makes me wonder, Rahab, we're told, by faith she protected the spies. We see it in her own words here, that she recognized who God was. And then when you look at the fact that she married into a Jewish family, ultimately bore an extremely godly man who became a type of Christ. The other thing that I find interesting about Rahab, and how it ties directly to God's redemptive plan, she's considered to be the first Gentile that was grafted into Israel. Now think about that for a second. What are we told about Gentiles? We're told, Paul tells us this in the book of Romans, that we Gentiles are grafted into Israel because God's redemptive plan surrounds Israel. And us Gentiles are grafted into Israel, into God's redemptive plan. And here we have Rahab as, again, most consider her to be the first Gentile that was grafted into, became part of Israel. There's some foreshadowing going there, and so we can see how Rahab plays an important part, and we know that she was specifically a part of the lineage of Christ because Matthew tells us that in the genealogy. And so we see the role that Rahab played by faith in God's redemptive plan, and again, her role in helping to save the world. How about 2 more, since we're already talking about Boaz? We have 2, Naomi and Ruth. These 2 incredible moms we find in the book of Ruth. And if you remember the story, we actually studied this here. It kind of starts with tragedy and then ends with just these amazing blessings. And so the book again starts with this conflict, if you will, that has to be resolved. There's a problem, there's tragedy. And we see how God works all of it out. Naomi was married to a man named Elimelech. They were Israelites. They had 2 sons, but due to this famine that was in Israel, they had to leave Israel and they went to the land of Moab. And we find that after they're in the land of Moab, Elimelech dies. So that leaves Naomi with her 2 sons. But then, tragically, 10 years later, her 2 sons die as well. Now, they had married Moabite women. One was Ruth, one was Orpah. I always want to call her Oprah, but it's Orpah. And the tragedy here is not just that Naomi had lost her husband, but she had also now lost her 2 sons. And so here she is, a widowed mother with 2 daughters-in-law with no means of caring for each other. No means of taking care. And typically, in a situation like this, what might happen is, especially in the Israeli culture, if a man died, if there was another brother who was unmarried, he was supposed to then marry that man's wife and produce children to carry on the name. And they would actually be under the name of the prior individual as well. But she can't even do that. And so we have tragedies on, multi-threaded tragedy here. She can't do anything to even, in some respects, redeem her sons or whatever. And so then what we actually find is that as she looks at her 2 daughters-in-law and she says, I can't do anything for you. You're still young. Go back home. I'll go back to Israel. You go back home. You get married. And so she's trying to provide for them as best she can. And so then we come to this interaction in Ruth chapter 1. So go ahead and turn to Ruth chapter 1. She basically tells Orpah and Ruth to go back home. Orpah first objects, then goes. But Ruth refuses to go back home to her own people and says she wants to stay and return with Naomi and go to Israel. And so she forsakes her home, much like Rahab did, her home, her family, her culture, and even her religion. And so look at Ruth chapter 1, verses 15 through 18, just a couple of verses here. They both weep in verse 14. Orpah kisses her mother-in-law and then leaves, but Ruth just clings to Naomi. Then she said, verse 15, Behold, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, Do not urge me to leave you or turn back from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people, Israel, shall be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. Thus may the Lord, Yahweh, there it is again, do to me, and worse, if anything but death parts you and me. Then when Naomi, saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more to her. That is a kind of a wow comment, isn't it? You've got this pagan Moabite woman who married into a Jewish family. One of them goes back to her gods. But something tells Ruth to stay with Naomi. There was something she saw in Naomi that just endeared her to her. And again, I think it's more than just simply, I got to be a good daughter-in-law. She could have done just what Orpah did and go back. She had been released of that. In fact, Naomi almost begs Ruth to do that. Earlier says, I got nothing for you. I'm so old, but I'm going to have a baby so that you can then wait for him to grow up to be your husband and take care of you. I got nothing to offer you. But Ruth says, doesn't matter. I'm going to go with you. Where you are, there I'll be. Where you lodge, I'll lodge. Your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. Pretty significant. And ultimately, you know the story, how it goes. I love this because they go back and immediately begin working on a plan. And the plan is to find a kinsman redeemer for Ruth. Now, a kinsman redeemer was just what we explained earlier. You've got an individual, a Jewish man, he's married to a woman. He dies, so then his brother is supposed to step up, or the nearest relative is supposed to step up and marry her, then produce children on his behalf. And so they begin to put this into play. And ultimately, to keep the story short, Boaz arises, a godly man. And it's just neat to watch this interaction in the story between Naomi and Ruth, because you can see the tenderness and the affection between the two. They interact more like a daughter and a mother than a mother and a daughter-in-law. And so there's this neat, sweet, tender interaction back before them. And so you see Naomi as, in some respects, the perfect mother-in-law, the perfect mom, doing what she can to take care of Ruth. And so Ruth ultimately ends up marrying Boaz. Boaz steps up to the plate, even though there was somebody else that sort of preceded him in line to become the kinsman redeemer, and that dude doesn't want anything to do with it because he's afraid of losing half his inheritance or half of his funds or whatever you call it, because some of that would go to, her, the other brother, so to speak, that had died, and so it gets convoluted, but essentially Boaz kind of just steps up to the plate, and he marries Ruth. And what happens? Ruth becomes a mom. And in fact, Ruth is also somebody that's in Matthew's genealogy, and you see that the heritage of Christ rolls back up to that, and we have another Gentile here being grafted into Israel. Boaz actually becomes a type of Christ, the one who redeems, and Ruth then also serves as a type, because Ruth is one who needed to be redeemed, which is just like us. And so we see the role that both Naomi and Ruth play in God's redemptive plan. And it's just exactly that. It's a story of redemption. They reflect the gospel probably better than the other two that we just already talked about, because their whole story with Naomi and Ruth is all about the kinsman redeemer, the need for people to be redeemed. And it includes a Gentile, which, again, is some foreshadowing for us. And so we can see how both Naomi and Ruth played the significant role in God's redemptive plan and saving the world. How about another one? Anybody remember who Hannah was? Hannah was the mother of Samuel. We read about her in the first 2 chapters of 1 Samuel. She has a lot in common with both Sarah and Jochebed. Like Sarah, she was barren for years before giving birth to Samuel. But then like Jochebed, she was able to care for Samuel. Even though she gave Samuel up, she's able to care for Samuel until he was weaned, and so their stories run somewhat parallel. Now what stands out to me about Hannah's story is her faithfulness to the promise that she made to God, especially considering that she was giving up her son, and yet she was still faithful to that promise. How many times have we heard, you see this in the movies all the time, in that, somebody's having a tragedy in their life and they promise God something, I will promise to serve you, or I'll promise to do this. And then God takes care of it, and then what do? Well, maybe there's a way to get out of this, maybe you don't have to fulfill this, But not Sarah. She just steps right up to the plate and does it. So make your way over to 1 Samuel, if you would. Just a couple of pages away from Ruth. Let's give you the background to start with. First, Hannah's husband, Elkanah, had another wife, Peninnah. And she would torment Sarah because she had children and Sarah couldn't. Imagine how gut-wrenching that would be. This may have been a situation where, much like Sarah when she gave her maidservant to Abraham because she couldn't have children, there may have been something similar to this going on, because Elkanah had a tremendous amount of tenderness and affection for Hannah. She was probably his first wife. She was barren. He may have taken a second wife, Peninnah, to have children. And so to put Sarah in this difficult position of being relentlessly mocked and mistreated by Peninnah. And so Elkanah, Sarah, and Peninnah would go up to the temple every year to worship. And Sarah, it says, would go into the temple and she would beseech the Lord to give her a child, and her prayer ultimately included a vow that she would make. 1 Samuel chapter 1, look at verse 9. Then Hannah rose after eating and drinking in Shiloh. Now Eli the priest was sitting on the seat by the doorpost of the temple of the Lord. She, greatly distressed, prayed to the Lord and wept bitterly. She made a vow and she said, O Lord of hosts, if you will indeed look on the affliction of your maidservant and remember me and not forget your maidservant, but will give your maidservant a son, then I will give him to the Lord all the days of his life, and a razor shall not come on his head. Now it came about, as she continued praying to the Lord, that Eli was watching her mouth, and you know the rest of the story there. He thinks she's drunk. She's like, no, I'm just pouring out my heart before the Lord. And we find out as we jump down into verse 19 that the Lord remembered, and there's that great word, remembered Sarah, and she gave birth to Samuel. And she did exactly what she promised to do. Look at verse 19. Then they rose early in the morning, and they worshipped before the Lord and returned again to the house in Ramah. And Elkanah had relations with Hannah his wife, and the Lord remembered her. It came about in due time after Hannah had conceived that she gave birth to a son, and she named him Samuel, saying, because I have asked him of the Lord. Then the man Elkanah went up with all his household to offer up to the Lord the yearly sacrifice and pay his vow. But Hannah did not go up, for she said to her husband, I will not go up until the child is weaned. Then I will bring him, and that he may appear before the Lord and stay there forever. Elkanah, her husband, said to her, do what seems best to you. Remain until you have weaned him. Only may the Lord confirm his word. So the woman remained and nursed her son until she had weaned him. Now, we don't know really what age this might have been. Same thing with Moses. We don't know how long it was before they had weaned them. Estimates are anywhere between the age of 4 and maybe as late as 12. But at some point, she weans him. He's done. Now when she had weaned him, verse 24, she took him up with her with a 3-year-old bull and with an ephah of flour and a jug of wine, and brought him to the house of the Lord in Shiloh, although the child was young. They then slaughtered the bull and brought the boy to Eli. She said, O my Lord, as your soul lives, my Lord, I am the woman who stood before you praying to the Lord. For this boy I prayed, and the Lord has given me my petition which I asked of him. So I have also dedicated him to the Lord. As long as he lives, he is dedicated to the Lord. And he, Samuel, worshipped before the Lord. Now, she continued to visit Samuel every year, because we're told that a little bit later in chapter 2. She would come up to the temple every year to worship, and she would bring him his ephod, which was basically it's like a breast outfit he would have to wear to worship. And so she would make him an ephod every year. She would go up to the temple, encouraging him in his ministry. And so I think about this, like how gut-wrenching this must have been. But she had made this promise to the Lord, and she followed through with it. She was faithful to that promise that she had made to him, even though it must have been rather gut-wrenching to have to hand over her son. Now, one of the things that I'm struck by with this, Samuel turned out to be probably one of God's most honorable and faithful servants. It's remarkable. You remember the relationship he had with David and others. And what strikes me as odd about this is when you go back to Eli, the priest, he was a terrible priest. His own sons were corrupt beyond belief. The Lord took Eli's life. He fell backwards in his chair and broke his neck as judgment from the Lord because of his sons. And I'm thinking, and Samuel, in some respects, was raised by him. But Samuel didn't turn out like the sons. We are shown the tremendous faith that Hannah had. And again, I'm struck by this, thinking she held on to him for those formidable years of his life and had a tremendous impact on him spiritually. I believe that's where Samuel got his faith. It had to be from Hannah. It could not have been from Eli. And it certainly wasn't from Eli's own sons, who would have been in some respects brothers to Samuel. And so we look at Sarah and the significant role that she played in God's redemptive plan by nurturing, caring for, and sharing her heritage of faith with Samuel, who then, like I said, becomes one of the most honorable and faithful prophets that we have in the Old Testament. Now, Matthew mentions 2 other Old Testament women in part of his genealogy, Tamar and Bathsheba. They're great study as well. Tamar, there's not as much on. Bathsheba, there's a little bit more. But you could even add another one to this, Abijah, who was the mother of the righteous king Hezekiah. If you remember, so oftentimes we're told in the Old Testament with these kings that they followed in the footsteps of their father, who was a wicked, wicked king. And you have this individual, King Hezekiah, who had a terrible father, but an amazing mother. In fact, she's named. That's all we know about her, Abijah. And again, I have to wonder, because so many of the terrible, terrible kings of the Old Testament just followed in the footsteps of their father. And apparently, Hezekiah followed in the footsteps of his mother. And I believe that the author, as he wrote about Hezekiah, the reason he mentioned Abijah by name was to carve it in stone, so to speak, that she might be honored in that capacity. So we could look at some of the others in the Old Testament, but I'll move on to the New Testament, just cover a few more here. The first one that stands out to me in the New Testament is obviously Elizabeth, the mother of John the Baptist. right out of the gate, Luke chapter 1 verse 15 says this, that they were both righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments and requirements of the Lord. So both of John the Baptist's parents were righteous in the sight of God, walking blamelessly in all the commandments of the Lord. Like Hannah and Sarah before her, Elizabeth was also barren. It says that she was advanced in years. According to Luke chapter 1 verse 13, Zacharias, and I would assume probably Elizabeth as well, had been petitioning God for a child year after year. And God finally answers that prayer for him. I want you to turn to Luke chapter 1. One of the remarkable things about Elizabeth, to me, is how profound her understanding was of the events that were transpiring with her pregnancy and Mary's pregnancy. She got it. I mean, you can just see it in what she says and how she behaves. Luke chapter 1, verse 39. Now at this time Mary arose and went in a hurry to the hill country, to the city of Judah, and entered the house of Zacharias and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the baby leapt in her womb, and Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit. And she cried out in a loud voice, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And how has it happened to me that the mother of my Lord would come to me?" Did you catch that? That can only be a reference to Christ. "For behold, when the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the baby leapt in my womb for joy. And blessed is she who believed that there would be a fulfillment of what has been spoken by the Lord." So we have this amazing declaration by Elizabeth. She got what was happening there. She fully understood it. Turn to verses 57, same chapter. "Now the time had come for Elizabeth to give birth, and she gave birth to a son. Her neighbors and her relatives heard that the Lord had displayed His great mercy toward her, and they were rejoicing with her. And it happened that on the 8th day they came to circumcise the child, and they were going to call him Zacharias after his father. But the mother, Elizabeth, answered and said, 'No, indeed, he should be called John.' And they said to her, 'There was no one among your relatives who was called by that name.' And they made signs to his father as to what he wanted to call him. And he asked her for a tablet, and he wrote on the tablet with follows, 'His name is John.' And they were all astonished." Now, why is that significant? Because it was typical to name the father, or name the child based on the father. But Elizabeth remembered likely what Zacharias had told her regarding what happened in the temple. I believe that it's more than just a name here, because what she's in essence doing is that she is declaring exactly what God said in the temple about this child and his role, what John the Baptist's role would be, and Elizabeth recognized that and wanted to make sure that they obeyed God in naming him exactly what God wanted him named. She understood that Mary was giving birth to the Lord. I believe she also understood that her child would be the forerunner that would announce the coming of the Lord. She was fully engaged and fully understood that. So there's clearly no question that Elizabeth played a role in God's redemptive plan. We're told about their own religious heritage, that they were both her and Zacharias were godly. They walked blamelessly before the Lord. And think about what we know of John the Baptist. Mature, godly, dedicated to exactly what he was called to do. Kind of gives us an idea of the role that parents often play with their kids' lives. We talk about this, that there's no guarantees, but if we don't act like we should, what hope do they have? The gospel revealed John the Baptist to have this impeccable understanding of the Old Testament. He was a prolific teacher, preacher. He devoted his life to the mission that God had given him. He was courageous. He carried out his task until he was martyred and put to death. No doubt, Elizabeth and Zacharias having an impact on him. And so we see Elizabeth's role there, because he was the forerunner, leading men to repentance, to accept Christ. Obviously, we have to cover Mary. We can't avoid Mary, can we? She probably played the most important role in God's redemptive plan, aside from Christ himself. I'd say that giving birth to the Messiah kind of ranks up there. I think sometimes what gets lost with the story of Mary is how young she probably was. We've always heard she's a young woman. The Bible doesn't tell us how old she was, but in the first century it was pretty common for girls to get married typically around 15, 16 years of age, but often as young as 12. That freaks us out today. Different world back then. So what we can probably assume about Mary is she was probably a teenager. Young woman, maybe 15, maybe 16 years of age. The Lord is clearly pleased with her. Turn to Luke chapter 1, verse 26. Twice in this passage, he refers to her as being favored of the Lord. Look at verses 26 and following. Now in the 6th month, the angel Gabriel was sent from God to the city of Galilee called Nazareth, to a virgin engaged to a man whose name was Joseph, and of the descendants of David. And the virgin's name was Mary. And coming in, he said to her, "Greetings, favored one, the Lord is with you." But she was very perplexed at this statement. Talk about humility there. But kept pondering what kind of salutation this was. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, for you have found favor with God." Twice we see that the Lord was pleased with her, found favor with her. You know, we get a pretty good picture of the maturity of Mary here. For being as young as she probably was, she was this incredibly mature young lady. Look at verse 38. Her response, "For nothing will be impossible with God," is what she was told. And she says, "Behold, the bond slave of the Lord." She just referred to herself there as a servant of Yahweh. "May it be done to me according to your word." And the angel departed from her. She was a child. She was a virgin. She lived in a culture that would ridicule or mock and sometimes stone those caught in adultery or those having children out of wedlock. The shame and everything else that would come along with that. So here's this young girl who first off is basically sitting in her room and an angel pops in there. If that doesn't freak you out. On top of that, he says, "Oh, you're going to be pregnant." And you're thinking, what? I'm engaged to a guy. What's going to happen with that relationship now? We see how Joseph initially wanted to respond. That's what Mary faced. She likely expected that to happen. Who's to say that she figured, Joseph will just deal with it? She likely expected Joseph to divorce her. How would she go back to her parents? How would she explain to any family and friends, "Look, no, I didn't sleep with anybody. This is all of the Lord." They probably would have laughed at her. That's what she's facing, but what does she do? "So be it, Lord. I'm your servant." That is some maturity that blows my mind. I don't know all of adults that would have that kind of maturity. Something else that we see about Mary here is that she had a pretty serious understanding of the Old Testament. You can read this on your own, but when you go to the Magnificat, Luke chapter 1, verse 46 and following, there are as many as 10 different either quotations or allusions to the Old Testament. Think about that for a minute. Her Magnificat, what she speaks, her praise to the Lord, was filled with Scripture, with an understanding. So her praise for the Lord after she just learned that she's carrying the Messiah is filled with the words right out of Scripture or with allusions right out of allusions right out of the Scriptures. So it's pretty amazing to see this young woman, this young mom, and the role that she played ultimately in helping to save the world. I'm just going to do a couple of real quick miscellaneous ones here. You don't necessarily have to turn there, but we'll wrap it up with just these. Eunice and Lois. Anybody remember those two names? Timothy, I think, is probably one of my favorite New Testament characters, aside from obviously some of the apostles and that. And the reason is he's just this. He's repeatedly referred to by Paul throughout his letters. We know that he was Paul's right-hand man. Paul calls him his child in the faith. There was this neat relationship between Paul and Timothy. And Timothy's one of these guys where, you think of the people you'd like to meet in heaven someday, and obviously we'd like to meet Christ. That would be good, But you'd also like to meet the apostles and that. Out of all of what I'm going to call the second-tier guys, Timothy's like my guy. He's the guy I want to run up to and just go, man, I want to see what he's like, Well, what's interesting is Paul in 2 Timothy chapter 1 attributes Timothy's faith to his mom and his grandma, Eunice and Lois. It says that he had learned the Scriptures from them. In fact, when Paul met him, he was already known in the community. He was already well respected in the community. It's not like Paul found him and then sort of raised him up and trained him and he became the great Timothy. He was already the great Timothy when Paul met him, because Paul says of his moms, Lois and Eunice. And again, you can see that in 2 Timothy chapter 1. The last one I want to mention is kind of a weird one, okay? Because we don't really have her name. You don't have to turn here, but you can write it down. Paul in Romans chapter 16, verse 13, At the end of his letter, when he's writing sort of his greetings, he tells them to greet this guy named Rufus, who he refers to as a choice man in the Lord, meaning good, godly individual. His name is Rufus. But then he adds this, also his mother and mine. His mother and mine. Now what Paul implied by that is not that Rufus was necessarily his brother. We don't think that. He likely is referring to Rufus's mother as his sort of influence that Rufus's mother had on him as well. And we don't know exactly what that is, but it was enough where Paul called her out. In other words, it's probably more like she's just like a mother to me. And for Paul to call her out meant that she had some influence on Paul's life. And again, we don't know exactly what that is, but enough to where he chose to mention her in the text. I think about that when it comes to my own mom. When I was growing up, my mom she ran the pool. And so when we'd go show up for swim team practice, she was always there when we got there for swim team practice. And I always made a point of shouting out to Mom, and I usually did it when I would be breathing. I'd say, "Hi, Mom!" when I'd see her come in. And everybody in the pool, they'd all shout, "Hi, Mom! Hi, Mom!" You know. When we were at the lake, there was some at the lake because my mom managed the lake too, and we were all lifeguards, and a lot of my friends were lifeguards. Some of them would refer to her as Mom, you know. Even to this day, we have a friend of ours, we've mentioned it here numerous times, Dave Baton. And the running joke now is that he's our brother, and so we even bought him a shirt that said favorite brother on it or something to that effect. We refer to him as the mom's favorite son. I'm number 2, my brother's number 3, you know. But he looks at her like he lost his own mom a few years back, but he takes care of her like a mom. There are others, too, that treat her like their mom. Some other friends that we have growing up that sort of look at her as an extended mom. That's a great legacy, is it not, to have? So my encouragement this morning to all of you moms here is to recognize and to realize the role that each one of you play. And it's not just as a mom, but think about it in light of what we saw here. All of you are saved, we presume. And your role in playing a part in God's redemptive plan with your children and even with maybe those that are outside your own family that may look to you, much like Paul looked at Rufus's mom, because ultimately you play a significant role in helping, and I'll say it as silly as it is, and help saving mankind by doing your role as a faithful, godly servant. You have a significant role in God's redemptive plan. Amen?